Welcome back to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. Today, we talk to Dr. Liliana Aguayo about disparities and obesity in cardiovascular health among diverse children and adolescents. Dr. Aguayo is a public health researcher who investigates the early life factors that contribute to the origins of disparities in cardiovascular disease in adulthood. Her work applies an intersectionality lens and socio-ecological theory framework to investigate resilience-promoting factors that can buffer the toxic effects of the social determinants of health. Specifically, she investigates the associations of adverse socioeconomic and social experiences with the development of obesity and cardiovascular disease among racial and ethnically diverse children. Through her research, she aims to generate the knowledge to inform evidence-based interventions that help public health practitioners, clinicians, and policymakers support the development of resilience in children and lessen the negative impact that facing adversity in early life has on cardiovascular health throughout the life course. Please remember to share this episode, subscribe to Alimentos Emociones podcast, both on YouTube and Spotify, and leave a comment, and press the notification buttons. Help us grow this channel. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. It's very exciting to have today's guest with us today, Liliana Aguayo. And, you know, this podcast has been over the last few seasons about appetite and eating behavior, or just behavior in general. But I think that in order to be really able to talk about these topics, we have to dive into what the subject of today's theme will be, which are like disparities related to obesity, cardiovascular disease. And I think that today we'll focus probably a bit more on adolescents and children, which is the work that Liliana does. So, you know, thank you so much for being here with us. It's a great pleasure, Liliana.
Thank you. And I'm thrilled to be here too. So thanks for inviting me.
Would you like to, shall we start with, you know, how did you get into this area, and where did you start your studies? Because it's interesting, you know, I think it's interesting for listeners of the podcast to understand like how we get into all our different lines of research.
Yeah. And I feel that I have a very unusual path. I started with my bachelor's in international relations in Mexico in El Colegio de San Luis, which is one of the subsidiaries of Colegio de Mexico. I did 3 years there, and then I was able to transfer my studies to Loyola University in Chicago, and I got a double bachelor's in political science and international relations from there. So I'm coming from the policy and like kind of international politics world. And from when I was a senior in college, I started working as a translator. And from the, I guess part of that was also to work as a research assistant and conduct interviews for bilingual studies. So that got me a little bit tiptoeing into public health and helping into massive data collection efforts that were being done in the United States with R1 funded projects to collect data with mother and children, and like with different kinds of studies also for the Department of Education. I translated some of the census, the US Census questionnaires. So I got to travel all over the United States to make sure that the translation was understandable for everybody. And I think I went to Puerto Rico a couple of times.
So this is, sorry, for the Latinx community of the US.
Yes, and it's very, I think I got to see the behind the scenes before I got the other version of it, to see how data comes into like what we usually just see in stats or things like that. and all the science that goes behind each question to make sure that they're interpreted as intended and things like that. So I worked at the Mexican consulate for a couple of years, and I didn't really enjoy that, and decided that the research aspect was just more fascinating to me, like the ability to just learn, and this constant learning was just amazing. As kind of like a part-time, I started volunteering in a non-for-profit clinic that does free services for the Polish and the Hispanic community in Chicago. And in order to qualify for the free services in this community, you have to be under the 250% of the poverty line. So it's
Under.
yeah, sorry, yeah, under. It's people who make usually minimum wage, or just have one person supporting the whole family are kind of on that scenario. And once they qualify, they get all kinds of free services. And this clinic is 100% volunteers from all of the hospitals in the area. So it's very fascinating because you see a lot of students and also very senior people like gastroenterologists, and everybody's wearing a different lab coat because the different hospitals have different colors or different like staples or things like that into their lab coats. But it's sort of like the community coming together to support the community.
What is the name of the nonprofit?
It's called communityhealth.org. And it's spelled as one word, community health.
Yeah.
They have dentists, they have all kinds of services. And when people get diagnosed for diabetes, they get a glucometer, and then they get strips. They get, I think, 30 strips each month that they have to come and pick up, but they don't just want to give it to them. They have to do a 5-week class in order to get this. And this is sort of like the graduation's present. And if they miss one session, they can make up one session, but if they miss 2, they have to restart the class. Mainly because when people get diagnosed for diabetes, there are a lot of things that need to change in your lifestyle, and just handing you a glucometer with strips and medicine, it's not necessarily helpful. Like, you need to learn more about the disease and understand what triggers what and things like that, and how to like also recognize the symptoms of, is your sugar high or low, and the risk for others if you have family. So I was teaching the diabetes classes in Spanish, and I was expecting my family in Mexico, a lot of them have diabetes. My dad lost both of his parents to diabetes. So it's extremely prevalent, especially from where I come from. And I've always been very interested in learning about diabetes. So I was teaching the Spanish classes, and I was thinking that there were going to be like people in their 40s, 50s coming to these classes. It was a lot younger than that. The clinic doesn't service children because children get free care in Illinois, but they start service at 18 and older. I had participants who were 18 years old who just got diagnosed type 2 diabetes. Most of them were in their 30s, like mid 30s, and very few were over 40, which was a much younger cohort than I expected to see. And it wasn't just one class. I was teaching this for 2 years, and every cohort just seemed to be getting younger and younger. One of the challenges that people had to finish the classes was access to childcare, that if they could not find somebody to take care of their kids, they would just not show up to the class, and then they will either have to make up the class or miss 2 sessions and then just drop off. So to kind of support them with that, I did a little bit of an adjustment to the classes, to include children activities or like family games and things like that. So we had Jeopardy at the beginning, and you can tell the kids were very excited, and I brought them like different toys and things like that just as presents for the winning families, and activities to keep the children entertained while the parents
so that they could bring them with them.
Yeah, so that they will also be able to attend the classes and complete the curricula, and to keep the children entertained so that they will not be distracting, because otherwise bringing them alone is not helpful if they're like just taking attention away from the parents. at some point I got volunteers to look after the very young ones so that the parents could actually pay attention into the classes. So I did like this massive reorganization of the class to make sure that we kept the cohort and that they were able to stay and complete the classes. But I think one of the things that kind of led me into I want to do public health and I want to focus on children was when they brought their kids, the kids had obesity most likely or most often, severe obesity, and even borderline morbid obesity. It was two parents that were in their 30s with children that were probably between 6 and 8 or 10 and already had developed morbid levels of obesity. So by the time these kids are probably 15, they're going to have type 2 diabetes. And it's not a matter of whether, it's a matter of when. Okay. It's if both of the parents have that early diabetes and that strong genetic roots of it, and the kids are already at those levels, and some of them already had fatty liver disease or were starting to show up some signs of comorbidity associated with obesity. I think the saddest part is that they have very little agency and they're not really making or have the ability to make any of the choices that could help them prevent these diseases. So it's not, when I started studying obesity, I think a lot of the discourse was we need to educate the parents and it's the parents' fault and all of this like blame the parents kind of thing. It's not really that. I feel that there are a lot of systemic issues that parents want what's best for their children. Yeah. And people who care for kids care for kids.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, I feel I haven't even like educators and schools, like they're doing it from what they think is best for them. Like nobody's intentionally trying to harm kids or do something that is adverse to them.
You don't intentionally say, stand there one day when when your child is 6 and decide that you want them to become obese or to have obesity, sorry, that's not, it's not what naturally comes out of you as a parent. So what is happening,
I think that sometimes the best intentions may not lead to the best outcomes. Mm-hmm. So we did some qualitative interviews with mothers in preschools in Mexico, and a lot of them grew up with very little. Yeah. And they want to give the kids what they never had. So I think that was one of the quotes that resonated the most. Like, I want to give my child everything. I want make sure that my child is not lacking the stuff that I was lacking when I was a child. And sometimes this translates into cupcakes or soda. Like soda was a luxury when I was growing up. So now that we can afford it, it's not because we're thirsty. It's because it's a symbol of a status.
Yeah.
And I want my child to know that they do not have to lack for anything, or the little luxuries of life are rarely available to us now and they weren't before. So I think that there are a lot of kind of good intentions that end up in bad habits or habits that may lead to increased risk for obesity. So leveraging from,
I mean, there's like an area, like a gray area there, because if you have access to being able to give them something to make up for it, that sounds, that's one area as far as intentions. But there is also the side of that there is like real poverty as well, and what happens there with the choices as well. I don't know.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So, where is the line between I can finally give them what I couldn't give them, and the fact that we are in a really sort of underprivileged space where the only access that we have is also to certain things that are not particularly that, good for us, or that where we get sort of where what we get sent or what we get given or what the access that we have to certain things are not necessarily what are going to be the most sort of healthy for us. Does that make sense? Or
Yes, of course. And I think that along with, when we think of poverty, we usually think the lack of financial resources.
Yeah.
I think time is also something that when you have limited resources, you also lack a lot of time to do things, because your time is either spent traveling in public transportation, or I don't know, doing two jobs, or just kind of turning off whatever fire needs immediate attention, rather than like, I'm going to have time for planning and cooking and going to the grocery store and get organic vegetables and do all of these things. Time is a luxury, and it's a luxury that it's way more like available for people who have more resources. And definitely makes a difference. It's not just when I was teaching in public health, I feel that I had a lot of people who had these overly simplistic explanations of like, oh, it's because they lack education. Nobody lacks education. People know fruits and vegetables are good for you.
Yeah.
But like, I'm sorry, you're not gonna come and like bring your Barbie to tell me that I need to eat fruits and vegetables. It's the time that doesn't really have like readily available access, and it takes time to prepare them, it takes time to get them, it takes time to like do all of those things, coordinate a household with like multiple children that have multiple things that need to get taken care of immediately. So
you could be time poor. So the definition of poverty might need to change, or or what do you lack? Not just the resources. So, does the definition of poverty is very much, like you say, one that, that relies on finance. Should we define it in a different way? Is just
I think that when we think about solutions, we need to have a more holistic approach, and like using like a sociological model to understand that it's not just the lack of money, and that handing out money is not going to solve the problem, because there have also been some interventions that literally give people checks and expect people to lose weight by having an extra cash influx. I think we need to understand that there's poverty in the community, that there's a lack of resources readily available, that your zip code is actually a stronger predictor than your genes for a reason. That there's time, and time is a luxury. And there's also like the lack of social models. And
what would be a model that you like?
What would be a model that I like?
I like models. So just, that help explain a picture.
I was thinking more of like people that we can look up to. That
modeling, like trans-theoretical model or something.
Yeah, like role models. I feel that the higher you go in the socioeconomic status, the more rarely available you have people to look up to in their health habits, and like families that are succeeding in many areas. And unfortunately, low-income communities don't have as many role models to look up to. I had students who come from low-income communities who, once they graduated, wanted to work as a receptionist because the dad worked in a factory and the mom was a stay-at-home mom. And to her, that was an office job. And we were thrilled to like revise her CV and help her get a job that was a little bit more than a receptionist for somebody who had a college degree and was also fluent in Spanish and English. But it was something that never occurred to her. Like, I feel that the idea of becoming a doctor or becoming getting a PhD or something, if you don't have those role models really available, it's a lot harder to see yourself doing that. And also the lack of representation influences that, because the media doesn't show brown doctors or Black professors or things like that. So I think that those are also critical issues that when you're poor, you just lack a lot more than money.
Lack of representation, that's a really good one.
When I was working on this, like just thinking I want to go back and get a PhD, and also because I had a lot of ideas and I was just like a little minion in the scale of people collecting data. So in a way, I felt that the lack of representation from people from the community was a critical issue. And I was good enough to collect data, but not good enough to be listened to when I had ideas. And like, I wasn't sitting at the table where the decisions were made.
Gender is also part of that as well, not sitting at the table. Would you agree?
Definitely.
So you took that, the lack of representation, the not being able to sit at the table. How do you create that role model when it doesn't exist, and how do you go to that, to that place? How do you start seeing yourself as being able to do this
together? So I think there were a lot of issues with the data that was being collected. Specifically, I was looking into cognition with older adults, and the tests were just literal translations. And one of the tests asked people to sort items, and we just give them a list. You start with 2 items, and then it keeps growing to 3, 4, 5, and they have to sort them by size. And when you get to 5, one of the items is elk. There aren't too many elk in Puerto Rico or Mexico or any Central American country. So that was this question that stopped everybody who spoke Spanish, just could not pass 5 because they didn't know that an elk was bigger than a donkey. I had never seen an elk before until I moved to the United States and went to a zoo. It's not an animal that you have rarely available or have an idea. It's like a deer. Is it much bigger than a deer, or like what is it? The data was being kind of read into as these people are like their cognitive ability cannot go beyond this question. So they're making assumptions based on their nutrition and things like that their cognitive levels are at X or Y.
Or lower than they are.
And some of the stuff that we read on headlines in the news comes from data that was collected very similarly. The nutrition data, I saw this TikTok video about Latinos eat salsa, not salad. So when you ask me if the item that you're using to research how many fruits and vegetables you have, it's a question on like, how often do you eat salad? I don't eat salad. I mix all my vegetables with my meat. And even though like it's probably 80% vegetables and 20% meat, we call it chicken and vegetables because we're proud to have meat in it. I don't know. And I kind of wanted to bring these issues to the table. And because I was a research assistant, I didn't have the voice to be heard. I think fortunately, I did meet a couple of PIs who I was able to share these concerns with, and they encouraged me to go into grad school. One of them actually wrote, he wasn't the person I was directly working with, but he wrote a couple of recommendations for me. And I think that those were sort of like friends that I work with, who, even though they had a much higher level than where I was at, I got to like go out to eat with them, and they saw me as a colleague more than like a hierarchical level. And I guess to an extent as a mentee. So I feel that they thought that I had something to contribute, and they encouraged me to pursue higher education. So I applied for grad school at the time that Obama was in power. And Michelle Obama's agenda was childhood obesity.
Yeah.
So because of that, USDA funded 4 transdisciplinary programs to bring in kind of mixed cohorts of people who will be trained in multiple disciplines, understanding that obesity is a very complex, multifactorial problem. And we don't need experts that are just like one-minded, but we needed people who were able to cross those lines and bring in new ideas. So I guess I was just at the right time in the right moment.
That's what it's about.
The right place, that it all kind of the stars align, and they saw me as like, she's coming from international studies and political science. She has research experience collecting data.
And that's how you jumped into sort of public health and epidemiology and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the main motivator for everything was going back to those kids that had very little agency and empowering those families to make better decisions with the limited choices that they have. Because it's also, I feel like a lot of people are like, well, they make poor decisions, and it's like they have poor choices. So they make the best decisions that they can with the choices that they have. It's easier to judge when you have a lot more choices and a lot more options. And I feel that I recognize that I have endured a lot, and that as a Hispanic woman in the United States, being an underrepresented population in academia, I haven't had a lot of things come by easily, but I still have had a lot of privilege. I had parents who encouraged me to pursue higher education. I was able to get access to mentors who pushed me to pursue this and saw something on me and convinced me that I was an eligible candidate for these things. And those are things that we cannot take for granted, especially like if we haven't acknowledged that a lot of people don't have those privileges. But
you took them as well.
Yeah.
You took the step, because
I think it takes courage.
Yeah, yes, I totally agree. But you also, you could be in a situation of not being so privileged, but also, being in the company of people who would encourage you, and you might not do it. So, there's also a personal quality to it.
Yeah, I think that
apart from the whole setting,
failure definitely paralyzes you. Like fear of failure, and to an extent, knowing that I had my family to back me up, that I wasn't going to starve if everything went wrong, that there was a community who was somewhat responsible to help me in case everything goes wrong, definitely help.
But that's also a very Latin thing.
Does that what?
That's also a very Latin thing. To have that, kind of like that nucleus is still a bit more formed, I find, than sort of other Anglo it's a very big generalization, but the sort of more Anglo-Saxon, the less sort of family structure. I am making a big generalization, but Latins do tend to have more of that sort of family structure.
The community sort of responsibility. I think that, and I would say the same for sometimes even more Asians too. They have a lot of like the way that we see family is as the like primary structure in society. I think that to a large extent, we see ourselves responsible for our children, and eventually our children are responsible for the parents.
Yeah.
Whereas the Anglo-Saxon tend to be a more individualistic society, where once you leave the nest, you're on your own. And once you turn 18, you're expected to leave the nest. and be an independent being. So there's definitely that pressure to individually succeed, as opposed to having that you have the community behind you to hold you back if anything goes wrong. I think that those are also cultural assets. When we're talking about resources, having those cultural assets definitely helps understand why some children succeed and others don't. In spite of being in underprivileged communities. I guess I was lucky to train as a transdisciplinary scholar in fully funded by the USDA in this I think it was an amazing program. Unfortunately, it got canceled with the Trump administration, who wasn't as convinced that obesity is a problem. But
you had you got your PhD by then or not?
Yes. Yeah. I got my PhD. I started in 2013. So that was right at the beginning of the, I was actually, I was the last cohort. So I think the fellowship started in 2011 and I got recruited in 2013.
But I always think that, it's still a very meritocratic society. And so by getting the PhD, you automatically kind of join a table of, it gives you that status that you also need to be able to have these discussions that you were just talking about, of not, of not being really able to have a voice, or of, people weren't going to listen to you. Unfortunately, having the PhD, makes people listen to you a bit more.
Yeah, I feel.
Or unfortunately, sometimes unfortunately.
It allows you to have a chair in the table.
Yeah.
And we do live in a relatively elitist society where the more initials you have next to your name, the louder your voice gets, or the more people are willing to listen to you. And it's not that training is the only source of knowledge, but it definitely helps you express your ideas in a more organized way. And I feel that we are all salespeople. It just makes you a better salesperson. I think that I was very fortunate to just kind of fall into the right circumstances and being able to pursue the PhD in public health. I also have a master's in public health that was within the same umbrella. Both of them were funded through the USDA. And I was able to collect data in Mexico with USDA seed grants to kind of start analyzing the things that I wanted to do and bring voice for those populations that also have been traditionally ignored because they are considered less accessible or things like that. And also to help move away from the, I don't know if you have heard the term white logic.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Those simplistic explanations of, it must be a lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
They must not know fruits and vegetables are good for them. That is oh my God. There's ignorance on both sides of the table.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Have you seen this book? I mean, I'm just curious because I've just found it. So it's called Inflamed, Deep Medicine of the Anatomy of Injustice.
No, but
it's a good one. I'll pass you and I'll put it down in the in the credits and everything so that people read it. But it talks pretty much about all these topics that you're talking about. Not more sort of from a social standpoint, but also a clinical standpoint. And I think your research just really kind of obviously. I think they've taken a lot of parts from the work you do and other people do in these areas of sort of disparities, and how inflammation in the body is caused from mainly from the disparities, So it's really interesting. But that takes me to, what are you doing now? And where are you at now? What are you working on? I've read some really interesting work that you've done. I'd really like you to sort of just tell us a bit about that.
So I'm glad that you brought inflammation, because I find inflammation so fascinating. And I think that it's sort of where, I guess, going back to this transdisciplinary approach, where all of the roads is the Rome of disease, where all of the roads, mental health, physical health, obesity, even exposures, chemicals and things like that. That's how our body reads things.
Yeah.
And
even mental health. I mean, not just the exposure, but, the exposure to other factors like mental.
Yeah. Like chronic stress develops inflammation.
They talk about other things like, just being in financial sort of, owing money for, the work, like for studying at university, having debt in that respect.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm really fascinated by the anatomy of inflammation, and also I've been delving a little bit on genetics. So for my dissertation, I collected data in Mexico and in Mexican children and mother diets, and also in Mexican children and mother diets in the United States. And I wanted to compare telomere lengths, which are the tip of the chromosomes that get reduced because of inflammation. And it's sort of a metric that absorbs the exposures of the environment and makes you age faster. And I guess the root of all of that is inflammation. But a lot of inflammatory markers tend to be kind of hard to read, because it's sort of like a picture that you have to cut the person on a bad day to actually recognize that there's a problem. But if there was a problem the whole week, last week, and not the one day that you are taking the measurements, it may not be as accurately measured. So I was trying to see if there was something that would be a better indicator of more chronic
inflammation,
adversity, and damage, like biological imprint of how we absorb the environment and the exposures that we have. So I came across telomere lengths, and I found them so fascinating. And especially because within the first 6 years of life, you lose the most telomeres that you're going to lose in your entire life. And whatever you're at age 6 or 7, that's kind of going to determine your longevity for the rest of it. So I wanted to see how that related to obesity, and also to the mothers and children's obesity. So I work a little bit on that. And then from there, kind of just going into the genetic route and why some people, in spite of their circumstances, are more resilient and seem to overcome all of the stress. I started looking into the orchid dandelion metaphor. I don't know if you have heard of it. So it's differential susceptibility, that you may have two people exposed to the same adverse exposure, let's say food insecurity. And one of them does very poorly, and one of them seems to just keep going. Like, things happen to both, and one of them just keeps going down the hill, has mental health issues, physical health issues, and everything. And the other one just keeps somehow just pushing through. So there's a metaphor for that, and they call it the orchid dandelion, that there are some children that are more like orchids, that if you put them in the ideal environment, they're going to flourish above and beyond. They're going to be magnificent. But if you put them in negative environments, they're going to have the worst circumstances, and they're very sensitive to their environment. But also the capacity to thrive beyond. Sorry?
Can you say what it's called again? Orchid
dandelion.
Right.
Dandelion is diente de león.
See, yep.
And the dandelion is a pest.
Yep.
It can be in concrete, it can be on walls, it can be anywhere. It doesn't matter how adverse the circumstances are, they keep bouncing back.
Yes.
It's sort of like the image of resilience. And there are some genetic components that are associated with that. So I found that really fascinating because it also talks about the environment, that if you have a great environment, it doesn't matter if you're an orchid or a dandelion, you're going to do well.
Yeah.
So we use that metaphor to see if it was kind of an individual behavior or like individual factors that get developed after birth, or if we can even find kind of a little bit of evidence of that in utero. So women who get exposed to gestational diabetes, who experience gestational diabetes, their children are at greater risk for macrosomia. So the risk, that's like a very established association, that if your mother has poor gestational cardiovascular health, either preeclampsia, diabetes, hyperlipidemia, any of those things, the risk for macrosomia or higher birth weights are always present. So we use a few genetic components that had been associated with the orchid dandelion and the differential susceptibility to see if the dandelions in adverse utero exposures had a lower risk. And there's specifically one that is called the warrior. And that gene, it showed that the warriors are like, and I think it's interesting because it's multiple dimensions. So you have the dimension that would be the one that tells you how well you survive, and the one that helps you thrive. And those are two different things.
Yeah.
So the warriors tend to do worse when the situations are not ideal, but on stressful conditions, they just become really sharp. They have a lot of dopamine going to their brain and they make better decisions. So they're very good when the situations are bad, but otherwise they're just kind of going by normal or less than normal. And the warriors tend to be a little bit more paranoid, that they have issues trying to make decisions. So what we found is that they're actually like those elements that they have seen in adults in different circumstances when they put them through adverse exposures and things like that were also present in utero. And the little warriors were fighting gestational diabetes risks, and were actually able to control their weight gain in utero better than the warriors. So there's a little bit of both, that is the environment, and a little bit of susceptibility that comes kind of predisposed from genetics.
Yeah.
I'm currently looking into housing and food insecurity.
Yeah.
And how differential susceptibility will affect in those environments, to try to better understand the association with food and housing insecurity. I think that a lot of people have done research on one or the other. And the reality is that when you have very limited income, you take from one, it's a balloon. The amount of air doesn't change. You press one or you press the other, and you just try to address whatever fire it's like.
Is lighting.
Yeah. So I'm trying to see to what extent the exposure to food and housing insecurity during pregnancy, kind of the outcomes for children associated with obesity and cardiovascular health in very early life. And also for the moms, to what extent exposure to one, the other, or both will lead to poor gestational cardiovascular health, with also all of the repercussions that we know, that a lot of people who tend to have gestational diabetes eventually develop diabetes. They have a harder time losing the pregnancy weight. There's just the risk for cardiovascular disease is a lot higher by having those things. So that's sort of where things are going now.
This has been a really, I mean, I think we could go on for a long time talking about this. You have done some really amazing work. I have like lots of little nuggets of, like questions of, to carry on asking myself in my own work. agency, systemic issues, white logic, cultural assets. Wow. I think you have left us with at least me with, a whole bunch of more questions than maybe answers, but that's always good. If you like research or if you like questioning yourself. Thank you. I will leave, links to certain certain papers that you've written as well, so that they can, people can find you. Where else could people find you if they were interested in getting in touch and in contact with you?
Yeah, so I'm in the Department of Global Health at Emory University as part of Rollins School of Public Health.
Do you use social media at all very much, or do you tweet at least or something, or not?
I do not. And actually, the department is very active in tweet. Carlos Del Rio is like the tweet master of public health. And I was about to open an account when Elon Musk tried to buy Tweet, and I was like, do I really want to join Twitter with Elon Musk on it? I have LinkedIn, so you can definitely find me in LinkedIn. Okay. I'm still kind of debating whether to do the tweet or not. I feel like I'm coming late to the party.
Listen, it doesn't matter if you come late. I think that you have a lot to say, and it's that getting it translated usually, into the community being able to hear about it. So I know you have your work where you disseminate it as well, but it's just so important for just other researchers, other people to have these conversations, and you're having this conversation, about really important subjects that, like I said, affect behavior, which is the topic that I like. So thank you. I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to add, Liliana.
Yeah, so I was thinking when you said inflame, I'm like, oh yeah, Raj Patel, he's amazing. There's also pathologies of power. I don't know if you have heard of that. Paul Former was actually collaborator with my department, and a lot of people knew him personally. He came and did one of the commencement speeches at Emory University, and at some point had an affiliation with the Department of Global Health. He passed away a few months ago, I think a month ago now. But everything he wrote is just, I think, it's coming from a place of a lot of passion for public health and a lot of anger after witnessing a lot of injustices and just things that should not happen.
Yeah.
That are so easily to fix, and yet we see those things again and again. Yeah. So I feel that for anybody who's interested in disparities work and understanding a little bit more, I think that looking into intersectional frameworks too, it's key in that it's not just race. Race is not a biological factor. It's a social circumstance where when things go wrong, they go really wrong, and the environment is not conducive for things to get better.
Yeah.
So understanding that big picture, I think it's for your students, if there's any key message or takeaway message, I usually end up with empower women, because ultimately, if you help women have better gestational cardiovascular health, their children will do better, and down the line, it's a little change that can have intergenerational consequences.
Yeah, big.
And also look at the big picture from a new lens, to question our explanations.
That is a really good ending message. I think we might have to leave it like this, because otherwise, the interviews get really long and people don't have the sort of staying power. I hope they do this time. I definitely hope they do. I just want to remind everyone to, if you liked this episode, to please leave comments and to press the notification button, and to be able to disseminate, conversations like this that I think are really, really important. Not everyone has like a public health background, and it's just important to be able to put these topics on the table. I don't think, from a clinical point of view, maybe they're not touched upon quite so much, and they do have so much to do with the reasons why we are living, the lives that we are. So thank you once again, Liliana, for being here with us.
And thank you for having me. This was a pleasure. I had a lot of fun.
And remember, everybody, we continue to nourish each other. Nos seguimos nutriendo. So until next time, we'll see you then. Gracias por escuchar un episodio más de Alimentos y Emociones Podcast. No olvides dejar un comentario, suscribirte al canal y presionar el botón de notificaciones. Ayúdanos a crecer. Y recuerda, nos seguimos nutriendo.